In the image, a young woman stood near a tall window, daylight spilling across her face with the softness of forgiveness. An infant lay in her arms, swaddled tight, small enough to disappear if she loosened her grip. Her expression was composed, practiced, the face of someone who understood that this moment was not meant for her but for the record. It was 1919. The war had ended, the guns silenced overseas, but its shadow lingered in parlors and kitchens, in the way men spoke softly and women learned to swallow questions. Peace had returned in name only. The house behind her was solid and respectable, built from red brick and quiet expectations. Lace curtains filtered the light. A piano sat against the wall, polished and untouched after sunset, as if music itself knew when it was no longer welcome. Neighbors admired the family for their restraint, their dignity, their ability to move forward without appearing broken. They spoke of rebuilding, of virtue, of sacrifice rewarded by stability. In such conversations, the woman in the photograph was never mentioned beyond her function. She was introduced as the mother, nothing more, no surname followed, no origin explained. The child, however, was recorded with care. His name appeared in the family Bible, written in steady ink between births and deaths, as if permanence could be willed through handwriting alone. Anyone glancing at the photograph would see nothing unusual, a mother and child, a moment preserved. Yet those who lingered felt a quiet unease, a sense that something in the image resisted being understood. The woman's arms held the child with a firmness that bordered on urgency, as if she feared someone might step forward and claim him. Her eyes did not meet the camera. They drifted past it toward a point unseen, as though fixed on a future she already knew would not be kind. The photographer's ledger recorded the sitting as brief. A few seconds, enough to capture light and shadow. Not enough to capture truth. History, however, is never in a hurry. It waits. Years passed. The house aged. Voices changed. Eventually the family moved on, their belongings divided, sold, or forgot. The photograph traveled from mantle to drawer, from display to storage, its importance shrinking with each move. It was during one of these quiet transitions that someone noticed a flaw, a small thing. A date on the back of the frame appeared overwritten, the original scratched out and replaced with darker ink. In the parish records, a baptism entry listed the child but left the mother's name blank. These details were easily dismissed. Clerical errors were common. Ink faded, memories failed. Yet when silence repeats itself, it begins to speak. The photograph had always been called normal. Motherhood was expected, unquestioned, rarely examined. But beneath the stillness of that image lay a question no one had wanted to ask. Who was she really? And why had her name been erased before it was ever allowed to exist? The story did not announce itself. It did not arrive with accusation or scandal. It lingered in the air like dust disturbed by careful hands, visible only when light struck it just right. To understand it, one had to return to the year the photograph was taken, to the unspoken rules that shaped every movement inside that house. In 1919, respectability was currency. A woman's worth was measured by her silence as much as her obedience. A child born under complicated circumstances could be folded into a household story with enough discretion and the right omissions. The woman in the photograph lived within these omissions. She moved through the house quietly, her footsteps learned and softened. She understood which doors she could open and which she could not. Her days were filled with routine, her nights with the weight of what could not be said aloud. The child slept in her arms, fed from her body, comforted by her voice, yet belonged in the eyes of the world to something larger and more powerful than her. The house offered shelter but not belonging, care but not recognition. She learned early that survival depended on agreement, that love could exist only within boundaries set by others. When neighbors visited, she stepped back. When questions arose, they were answered for her. The photograph was taken during one of those carefully managed moments when appearances mattered more than truth. She was dressed neatly, positioned near the window where light could soften her features and hide her fatigue. She was told where to stand, how to hold the child, when to remain still. The camera clicked. The moment passed. What remained was an image that suggested completeness, stability, order, but the woman knew better. She knew that photographs could lie without intention, that they could preserve surfaces while erasing depths. As the years unfolded, the child grew. His name was spoken freely, his future planned with confidence. The woman remained present but unseen, her role reduced to labor and quiet care. She watched from the edges as decisions were made, as milestones were celebrated without her acknowledgement. There were moments when she considered speaking, when the weight of invisibility pressed too hard. But she also understood the cost. The world beyond that house was not kind to women who disrupted order. Silence, though heavy, offered protection. And so she carried it day after day like the child she once held in the photograph. Time moved forward as it always does, indifferent to fairness. The house eventually emptied. New families passed through its rooms, unaware of the stories that clung to the walls. The photograph, stripped of context, became an artifact rather than a testament. It waited patiently for someone willing to look beyond its surface. When inconsistencies were finally noticed, they did not immediately lead to answers. Instead, they opened a space for doubt. Why had a date been changed? Why was a name missing? Why did no one remember the woman beyond her image? These questions lingered unanswered, creating a quiet tension between what was seen and what was known. The photograph remained unchanged, yet its meaning began to shift. What once appeared ordinary now felt restrained. What once suggested peace now hinted at endurance. The woman's averted gaze took on new weight. Her grip on the child seemed less tender and more defensive. The image no longer reassured, it asked. And history, having waited long enough, leaned closer. There was no single moment of revelation, no dramatic uncovering. Only a slow realization that normalcy had been constructed, maintained through careful omission. The photograph had done its job. It had preserved an acceptable version of events, one that allowed everyone involved to move forward without discomfort. But truth does not vanish simply because it is ignored. It settles. It embeds itself in records, in handwriting, in the spaces where names should be. Eventually someone listens. The photograph still exists. Its frame remains worn. Its glass still catches light unevenly. To the untrained eye, it remains what it always was: a mother, a child, a moment in time. But for those who understand what it conceals, it carries a heavier weight. It stands as evidence that some lives are recorded without being recognized, that some stories are preserved only through absence. The woman's name may have been withheld, but her presence endures, suspended in silver and shadow. And the question she leaves behind remains, quiet and persistent, waiting for the truth that will finally give it rest. In 1919, paper decided who mattered. Ink decided who would be remembered. A woman without lineage was a woman without defense, and this truth was understood long before it was ever spoken. In that house of brick and lace, records existed for those whose names carried weight, whose bloodlines could be traced through ledgers and Bibles. Others existed only in the margins, their lives pressed thin between duties and silence. The young mother from the photograph lived inside those margins. She did not belong to the family, yet the family depended on her. She woke before dawn, her feet memorizing the cold boards of the kitchen floor, her hands already moving through tasks learned so well they no longer required thought. She cooked meals she rarely shared. She cleaned rooms she was never invited to rest in. When guests arrived, she lowered her eyes and stepped aside, becoming part of the furniture, present but not acknowledged. Her presence was tolerated because it was useful. Her past was left untouched because it was inconvenient. Questions, if asked at all, were redirected with practiced ease. Whispers filled the spaces where truth refused to stand. They slipped through corridors like drafts through old walls, quiet but persistent. Some said the child was a blessing delivered by fate, in answer to prayers no one wanted to discuss. Others spoke more carefully, lowering their voices until words barely formed. They spoke of a widower, respected and grieving, a man who carried loss like a badge of honor. They suggested comfort was found where society would not look, in rooms closed tightly enough to keep reputations intact. Power has always preferred shadows. In those shadows, consent becomes difficult to measure and silence becomes a form of payment. The woman understood this balance even if she never named it. She knew what could be said and what must remain unspoken. Her name never appeared on official documents. It did not grace invitations or legal forms. Instead, she was reduced to function. The help, the girl, the mother, titles that explained her usefulness while denying her personhood. When the child cried in the night, it was her arms that soothed him. When fever came one winter, it was her body that stayed awake, pressing cool cloth against small skin, whispering reassurances into the dark. Yet when the physician arrived, it was another woman who signed the ledger, another hand that made the moment official. Recovery was celebrated openly. Gratitude was distributed generously. Everyone was praised except the woman who had never slept. Injustice did not arrive with raised voices or visible cruelty. It arrived dressed in manners, in schedules, in doors that closed gently but firmly. It arrived in decisions made without her presence, in conversations that ended when she entered the room. The household ran smoothly because it was designed to. Every role was defined, every boundary enforced. The woman continued her duties, her motherhood folded neatly into labor, hidden where it could not disrupt the story being told. Love, when acknowledged at all, was framed as obligation rather than bond. She was expected to care without claim, to give without recognition. As the child grew, his questions were anticipated before they were ever asked. Answers were prepared, rehearsed, and delivered with confidence. He was told what he needed to know and nothing more. By the time curiosity stirred, explanations had already hardened into fact. The household maintained its version of events, polished and presentable, a narrative that allowed everyone to sleep at night. The woman watched this shaping of memory from the edges. She understood the cost of challenging it. To speak would mean more than disagreement. It would mean disruption. It would mean stepping out of the shadows into a light that offered no protection. She had seen what happened to women who broke silence. Stories traveled quickly, sympathy did not. Survival depended on restraint. So she learned to whisper only to herself, to store truth in quiet places where it could not be taken from her. Days blended into years. The rhythm of the house never faltered. Meals were served. Floors were scrubbed. The child's laughter filled rooms she was never invited to sit in. There were moments when she allowed herself to imagine a different life, one where her name might be spoken without hesitation, where her role would not require explanation. But those moments were brief. Reality pressed back in, firm and unyielding. The world beyond the house was no kinder. Respectability was a shield she did not possess. The house, for all its limitations, offered shelter. It demanded silence in return. History at the time took no notice. It favored those who spoke loudest, those whose names filled pages and monuments. The woman remained unrecorded, her existence acknowledged only through the labor she provided and the child she bore. Yet history is patient. It remembers what people try to bury. It listens for the whispers that echo long after voices fall quiet. The woman's life unfolded without ceremony. Her days were marked by repetition rather than milestones. Her love was constant, though rarely visible. She learned to measure joy in small increments, in moments stolen between tasks, in the quiet satisfaction of seeing the child safe. Even as she remained unnamed, she was not absent. Her presence shaped the household in ways no record could capture. She was there when illness struck, when grief surfaced unexpectedly, when the order of things threatened to fracture. She held the pieces together without ever being allowed to claim them. Over time, the whispers softened, replaced by familiarity. Extraordinary became routine. The injustice became invisible. This is how systems endure. They do not rely on cruelty alone. They rely on comfort, on the ease of not questioning what works. The woman understood this too. She carried the weight of that understanding, heavy but quiet. She knew that her silence was not consent but survival. And survival in that world required sacrifice. When the child finally stood tall enough to look beyond the walls of the house, the woman remained behind. His future unfolded along paths prepared for him, paths lined with opportunity and recognition. She watched from a distance, pride and sorrow intertwined. Her contribution would never be acknowledged publicly, but it was carved into her bones nonetheless. History moved forward, recording events that fit its preferred shape. Wars ended. Buildings changed hands. Names were written and rewritten. The woman's story remained where it had always been, tucked between lines, preserved only through absence. Yet absence leaves its own mark. It creates gaps that invite questions. It leaves spaces where truth eventually demands to be placed. The household's version of events endured for a time, smooth and unchallenged. But time has a way of loosening even the tightest narratives. Documents age, ink fades, people who knew how to keep secrets disappear. What remains are fragments, a photograph, a missing name, a ledger signed by the wrong hand. These fragments wait. They gather meaning slowly, quietly. They do not accuse. They simply exist, stubborn and unresolved. The woman may never have spoken her truth aloud, but it did not vanish with her silence. It settled into the structure of the house, into the routine she maintained, into the child she raised. History may favor those who speak loudest, but it never forgets those who were forced to whisper. And one day, when someone listens closely enough, those whispers rise, not as noise, but as memory, asking the same question again and again. Who was she? And why was her name never allowed to be said? The truth did not arrive with noise. It came the way dust settles in forgotten rooms, unnoticed until someone pauses long enough to see it move in the light. In 1947, the parish office smelled of old paper and boiled ink, the kind of place where time felt pressed flat between ledgers. A clerk sat alone at a narrow desk, turning pages that had not been touched in years. His work was routine, mechanical, guided more by habit than curiosity. Baptism records, births, dates, names, lives reduced to lines and margins. It was in one of those margins that the past shifted. A baptism ledger from 1919 lay open, its spine cracked, its pages brittle. The ink had faded unevenly, some names still bold, others barely legible. Beside the child's name, written in a hand that did not match the rest, was a single sentence, small and restrained. Mother present, name withheld at request. The words were simple, almost polite. But they did not belong. The script was tighter, hesitant, as if written by someone aware of being watched. Requests imply authority, and authority, even when it hides, leaves marks behind. The clerk paused, his finger resting on the page longer than necessary. He had seen omissions before. Clerical mistakes were common, yet this felt deliberate. The line had been added after the fact, squeezed into a space not meant for it. Someone had wanted this recorded, and someone else had wanted it limited. Curiosity, once awakened, is difficult to quiet. The clerk searched for related entries, his movements slower now, more careful. That was when he found the envelope. It was wedged between marriage records from the same year, its edges yellowed, its seal long dry. No name marked the outside, just a date written faintly and a cross pressed into the paper with a dull pen. The envelope resisted opening, as if it had been waiting to be left alone. Inside was a single letter. The paper was thin, creased from being folded and unfolded too many times. The ink had bled slightly, letters crowded together as if space itself were scarce. It was written in a careful hand, deliberate but unsteady, like someone forcing themselves to remain calm. The name appeared at the top, written once and never repeated. Her name, the woman from the photograph. It sat there, fragile and real, pressed into the page as though she feared it might disappear if she did not anchor it in ink. The letter was not addressed. It was not signed. It was never meant to be sent. It was meant to exist. She wrote of promises made quietly in rooms where voices were lowered and doors were closed. Promises that did not survive daylight. She wrote of a child acknowledged only when witnesses could be controlled, when truth could be shaped to fit respectability. She described how her future had been discussed without her presence, negotiated by others as if she were an inconvenience rather than a person. There was no anger in her words, no demand, only clarity. "I have loved him openly," she wrote, "even when I was asked not to exist." The sentence stood alone, heavier than any accusation. The clerk read the letter twice, then again, slower each time. He did not know her. He had never seen the photograph, yet he felt the weight of years settle around him. By 1947, the household she described was gone. The house itself had changed hands, its rooms repurposed, its history softened by time. The child she wrote about was no longer a child. He had grown, taken the family name, moved easily through a world prepared for him. His stability had been built carefully, brick by brick, on silence he never had to consider. He lived comfortably, unaware of the cost paid to make that comfort possible. The woman had not lived to see this discovery. She had died decades earlier, her burial modest, her marker shared with no one. No name carved deep enough to invite questions. Her absence had been tidy, convenient. The kind history prefers when it does not wish to be challenged. The clerk sat back, the letter resting in his hands. He understood in that moment that he was holding something that had never been allowed to breathe. Revelations rarely arrive with thunder. They do not shout. They wait. They trust that someone someday will listen. This truth did not seek punishment. It did not demand correction or justice in the way courts understand it. It sought recognition, to be seen, to be named. The ledger and the letter told the same story from opposite sides of silence. One recorded the omission, the other explained it. Together they formed a complete sentence history had never finished writing. The clerk returned the letter to its envelope, his movements careful, almost reverent. He made a note in the margin of the ledger, small and precise, linking the records without commentary. He did not announce the finding. He did not call attention to himself. He understood that this kind of truth did not need spectacle. It needed preservation. Outside, church bells rang the hour, their sound steady and indifferent. Life continued, as it always does, unaware of the quiet shift that had just occurred. In archives and offices, in drawers and boxes, history waits for moments like this. For hands willing to pause, for eyes willing to look twice. The woman's words remained private, but they were no longer lost. They existed now within the structure that had once erased her. Ink had done what voice could not. It had endured. The photograph from 1919 still looked the same. A woman, a child, light through a window, but meaning had changed. The image no longer stood alone. It was anchored to language, to evidence that refused to be smoothed away. The woman's name, once withheld at request, now rested where it belonged, even if only in a sealed envelope and a narrow margin. The truth did not rewrite the past. It could not return what had been taken. But it altered memory, and memory alters legacy. Those who would come later might never know her face beyond the photograph. They might never speak her name aloud. Yet the record existed, patient and undeniable. History had listened. Not because it was forced to, but because someone had been willing to hear. And somewhere between those brittle pages, between a line written too small and a letter never sent, a woman who had been asked not to exist finally did. Some truths wait decades for acknowledgement. Some names find their place only after silence has done its work. And even then they do not ask for forgiveness or reward. They ask only to be remembered. The house came down without ceremony. In the early 1950s, workers arrived with measured steps and folded plans, their boots pressing into soil that had absorbed decades of quiet living. Walls that once held whispers were reduced to brick and dust. Windows that had filtered light onto a woman's face were shattered and cleared away. Where lace curtains once softened the world, steel beams rose instead. The new building was a post office, designed for efficiency rather than memory. Letters would move quickly through its halls. Names would be sorted, stamped, delivered, then forgotten. No marker was placed to say what had stood there before. Progress rarely pauses to remember what it replaces. The photograph survived only because it was small enough to be overlooked. It was packed into a box with other objects deemed harmless, sentimental, unimportant. Years later, it was donated to a local archive, labeled simply as a family artifact. No explanation followed. No story accompanied it. The woman and child returned to silence, this time under fluorescent lights and catalog numbers. Curators displayed the photograph briefly, drawn to its softness, its calm composition. Visitors passed by without stopping. At first it appeared unremarkable. A mother, a child, history preserved as it liked to see itself. But questions have a way of forming once something is seen long enough. A researcher noticed the missing name. Another wondered why the date seemed uncertain. The image was removed from display not because it lacked value, but because it carried too much. Some questions could not be answered without discomfort, and institutions like families often prefer comfort, yet discomfort is often where justice begins. Quietly, without announcement, the parish register was amended. The woman's name was added in careful ink decades after her death. The correction was small, almost ceremonial. A single line restored where there had been absence. No apology accompanied it, no public notice. Still, it mattered. With that addition, the narrative shifted. The woman was no longer an unnamed figure holding someone else's legacy. She was a mother, without footnotes, without conditions. Those who studied the photograph afterward began to see it differently. What once appeared gentle now carried strain. The tension in her hands became visible, fingers pressing into cloth as if holding on required effort. The distance in her gaze felt intentional, protective rather than vacant. Context reshaped the image. Knowledge changed posture, expression, meaning. This is the quiet work of truth. It does not alter objects, it alters understanding. The child's descendants were informed of the findings. They listened. They nodded. They chose silence. Some histories are inconvenient. Others are inconveniently honest. Silence once again became the easiest response, but the archive did not retreat. The record remained intact. The letter stayed preserved. The ledger held its correction. Ink does not forget. Paper does not lie. It waits. The photograph still exists. Its frame is worn, its surface slightly clouded. At first glance it looks ordinary, but those who know its story understand what it carries. Proof that dignity can be denied but not erased. Some names only find peace when the truth is told.